the forefront, and policymakers do have the responsibility to help those enterprises to come up with new ideas. We do have, in terms of policy objective, right now an ambitious one, which is to create a single wireless space in Europe, an internal market where the telecom services can be sold everywhere in Europe, it can be purchased everywhere in Europe, and spectrum would be utilized in Europe very much in a uniform way, with uniform rules. Is it important? Yes, it is. Because the scale or scope in innovation in technology are important. Size does matter. We do need innovative companies, but also we need the size and scale for those companies to have a market. And a market of 500 million citizens is the market number 2 in size in the world, and market number 1 in terms of wealth. So Europe, as a single market, makes the difference in terms of world competitiveness. Each national market, for how big they are, they will not make the difference. That's why, I mean, whether we like it or not, I think we like it, we have to work together in Europe. The Commission is working on a policy proposal which is about completing the telecom single market, and an important part of this proposal is about spectrum policy and innovative spectrum policy. So the idea is not to create new bureaucracy, is not to centralize powers in Europe. This is absolutely not the idea. We are perfectly happy to cooperate in Europe with the competent regulators that we have, and here in France we have the example of a very competent regulator that also is leading in the RSPG, doing a very good job. So the idea is not to create a new bureaucracy or sort of European spectrum regulator, is to make sure that the competent authorities can work together with the Commission ex ante in defining the condition to release new spectrum, and ex post in analyzing how each member state assigns the spectrum through tender conditions. We see too much variation in Europe. We see, without any reason, I mean, a spectrum being assigned at very high prices in one country and very low prices in another country. Spectrum is not for making money. I mean, this is not the way we spur innovation in spectrum. We do need efficient spectrum assignment, and this probably is best done through the means of an auction, for instance, when it comes to commercial spectrum. But the auctions should not be designed to extract money from the private sector. They should be designed to be efficient and to have the best and most innovative company have access to the spectrum. So the whole idea of the spectrum reform is cooperation, and is to make sure that the expertise in Europe can be pulled together, to make sure that once the spectrum conditions are defined and the assignment is defined, this is done in a way that does not hinder innovation. A final word on the 700 megahertz, which is the next big release of wireless spectrum for commercial purposes. Why 700 megahertz is very important? It is important because this band is the band utilized all over the world for 4G. So it, again, in terms of scale and scope, creates opportunities for European companies and European citizens. We would like, in the general policy framework, to have a policy instrument to collectively decide when the spectrum should be released in Europe and which conditions, and then through a stakeholder debate where all stakeholders from public and private sector will be involved, decide on what is going to be the best date for release of the spectrum in a coordinated fashion. We have done this exercise already for what is called the first digital dividend, 800 megahertz, but this exercise led to quite a diverse response in Europe, and we still are in the middle of trying to release this digital dividend one. The A net result is that some terminal manufacturers are not believing that Europe is serious when releasing new spectrum, and they are not including those bands in the terminals, as you know. So in 700 megahertz, we need a completely different way to work together. So in conclusion, I really welcome this conference. I welcome the idea that spectrum is linked to innovation and transformation of the society, and all is for regaining a competitive position in Europe, the competitive position that France and Europe deserve in the spectrum area. And I'm sure together, working together, this is going to be possible. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Viola. Le premier 700 MHz de la journée a déjà été prononcé. Je vous invite à placer vos paris sur Twitter sur combien de fois on va utiliser ces termes qui seront, je pense, chauds au cours de la journée aujourd'hui et demain. Peut-être déjà dès la première table ronde, je me permettrai de présenter en anglais puisqu'un certain nombre d'intervenants y sont anglophones. Le thème, comment la mobilité transforme la société et stimule l'innovation. How is mobility shaping our society and stimulating innovation? This first roundtable is going to be hosted by Martin Sims of Policy Trackers, if Martin will join me on stage. It will be introduced by Martin Cave, another Martin, who is Professor of Economics at Imperial College and a Deputy Chair of the UK Competition Commission. Sorry. Our other guests are Joël Menrad, who is a sociologist. Frédéric Pujol of IDAT. And Abdul Karim Soumaila from the UAT. I will leave that to you, Martin.
Yeah.
It's all yours, Martin.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me say it's a great pleasure to be invited to give the presentation at this important conference, and also to note that everything that I shall say is said in a personal capacity rather than on behalf of any organisation with which I'm associated. The remarks I'm going to make and that I think we're going to discuss in this session follow on very neatly from the two initial presentations, notably some of Roberto's remarks about innovation and how it can be stimulated within a European context. Just looking back, however, it's important, I think, to note how radical the transformation has been as a result of the coming together of two sort of changes in general purpose technologies. The first is mobility, so that communications can be offered on the move. And the second, of course, is data, so that data can be communicated instantaneously rather than just voice. And these two things, of course, come together in the innovation of mobile broadband, which is, I suspect, the source of acute interest in Europe in spectrum questions and in questions of innovation. I mean, I can just about dimly remember what life was like before these two things existed. You know, at a time when evenings were evenings and weekends were weekends, and there was a very clear distinction between the work period and the leisure period. For most of us who work in the service sector, of course, that's now completely disappeared. What I want to do then is just make some introductory remarks about various aspects of this from my perspective, which I suppose is largely that of a sort of a competition economist rather than anything else. Examples of impending innovations or innovations in the course of diffusion, very striking ones such as Google Glasses, which seems to me to be a slightly doomed innovation, but one with, of course, potentially huge social consequences as well as economic consequences. I understand that Apple's relying more upon people carting things around on their wrist in a similar fashion, there'll be all sorts of other things coming along which bring together data processing, video capability, and of course communication. Now, where do these innovations broadly come from? I think if you compare this round of innovation with the innovations that took place in the broader telecoms world before about 1990, there have been huge changes. I mean, those innovations, broadly speaking, came from the suppliers of network companies, equipment suppliers. They were basically hardware-based. They came from a variety of different countries, and Europe was quite strong in that regard through companies such as Ericsson and others. If you look at this latest round of innovations, then they generally tend to come from IT companies, Microsoft, Apple, Google. They come from large companies. I suppose that's inevitable, but often those large companies have actually acquired the capability, the innovative capability, not through internal growth, but by acquisition, by buying up much smaller innovative companies. And perhaps most disconcertingly for us, perhaps, they almost invariably seem to come from the United States. I accept, of course, certain innovations that have come from Japan and Korea, but all the innovations which I've already listed do derive to a large extent from the United States. Now, why might this be? There's obviously been a lot of discussion of the effect of the West Coast cluster effect, because most of the companies which I've mentioned do actually originate from there. Qualcomm, of course, is further down California and falls into this group. They do seem to be based very strongly upon entrepreneurship. I've done quite a lot of work in relation to Google and the amazing history of Sergey and Larry, originally in their garage, which seems to be the origin of choice for many very large companies. The weekend where they just assimilated the whole computing capacity of Stanford University to test some of their early ideas. I mean, that kind of story is certainly one that I guess is unlikely to be repeated in any academic institution of which I've been a member in the United Kingdom. So there's that extraordinary aspect of it, the entrepreneurship. There's a very big home market that is available in the United States. I think Roberto's right to emphasize that we need to develop within Europe an equivalent very large home market in order to achieve that kind of demand-side potential, which the United States has illustrated so well. The United States has, of course, a very distinguished inheritance of sort of official research organizations. I call them official. I don't necessarily mean that they're public, because they can be private, like the Bell Labs. What is noticeable is that that particular source of innovation hasn't really been a factor in any of it. It's the other side of the country. It's in large offices rather than garages and things of that kind. Now, what has the consequences of this been? Well, the social effects of it, I think, are almost too many to name, and it's outside my academic specialism. So I should just allude to a relatively small number, and I hope that we'll be able to focus upon one or two in the discussion which follows. I mean, the implications for privacy, for example, are really quite extraordinary. We've recently been reminded of the degree of surveillance that can be carried out by governments upon private citizens. But that is, I suspect, has nothing compared with the degree of information which large companies are collecting upon us, on our patterns of behavior. And the consequences of that might very well be very far-reaching. They appear, particularly amongst the younger generation, to have altered in a major way traditional patterns of behavior and reliances. I mean, it's well known, for example, that when young people get into difficulties, they aren't likely to ring the emergency number, but they're more likely to put out an all-points alert bulletin on their Facebook page or something like that. And this is quite capable, actually, of producing very effective rescues in various circumstances. But I'll leave those implications to the later discussion. What about the economic effects? Well, from my perspective as a competition economist, the development successively of these new technologies and new giant firms does present a considerable challenge to the conventional wisdom about how one addresses competition problems. It's potentially much more of a Schumpeterian world in which one innovation replaces another, and that competition is for the market rather than for particular customers within the marketplace. And one has, of course, to keep a very close eye upon the dynamic consequences of any innovation, of any interventions which competition authorities might make in this type of situation. However, I think it's also clear that there comes a time when a particular position of dominance gets very well entrenched. There doesn't seem to be any obvious means because of barriers to entry for it to be replaced. And in those circumstances, then competition authorities generally do have to act. And we've seen this dilemma being confronted in a very vivid form in the various competition investigations which have taken place into Google's position in the search market. The United States one has broadly been completed, but as you know, the current commission investigation into Google's activities in search is still in place. But perhaps from a competition perspective, one of the most difficult and challenging issues is what to do about patents. There is a nightmare problem in dealing with technical advance in this area associated with the existence of standard essential patents. That is to say, patents which have been embodied in some kind of standard and which therefore all competitors in that marketplace have to have access to in order to allow them to compete. And this is a huge problem for competition authorities. It's a problem to identify which they are. It's even a greater problem to try and establish whether there's any kind of abuse over licensing arrangements. And the third problem is to decide what might be an appropriate, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory pricing regime for such patents. And clearly, if the competition authorities can't address this question, then particularly for a country or an area like Europe, which is not particularly well endowed with those standards essential patents, the opportunities for advance are going to be quite restricted. So I flag that as being an extremely important element in enabling us in Europe from a production point of view to be able to succeed in the area of mobility-based innovations. Now, I want to come back finally to just make a few remarks about what the implications are for all these developments for spectrum regulators, like our hosts, the ANFR, which is a very distinguished and spectrum regulator, very advanced in European terms, which has many successes under its belt. My own view is that it's very important that spectrum regulation should move, as it is in France, in ways which actually are deliberately designed to promote innovation. Now, what might those be? Well, I have been for quite a long time an exponent of the use of liberalization of spectrum, that is to say, enabling spectrum to be used at will by the licensee for whatever purpose seems appropriate. And I've also been in favor of the tradability of spectrum, so that if somebody has a license to spectrum which they aren't using very productively, it can actually be passed on to another organization for a suitable agreed sum of money, the consequence of which it will be used more effectively. So I think liberalization and trading are an important goal to pursue, as they are being pursued in France. But another thing which is important, which Roberto also alluded to, is spectrum sharing, trying in some sense to unpack the spectrum so that more uses and users can be inserted within particular bands. The most obvious example of this is the so-called white spaces, which enable the coexistence of broadband activities, for example, with broadcasting activities using unused components of the band. I think it's very important that we press ahead with this, and I note that there is going to be a session devoted to this later within the conference. So to summarize then, from a European point of view, I think that there is huge scope for us to deploy our resources in a more efficient way. It depends upon the private sector, but there's an awful lot that regulators, both competition regulators and spectrum regulators, can do in order to achieve a situation in which the full benefits of mobility and data can be deployed in the social interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'd like to start this session, first of all, by introducing myself. My name's Martin Sims, and I'm from Policy Tracker. We're a newsletter which writes about spectrum policy. We have been writing about spectrum policy for the past about 9 years. So it's something we should be very familiar with, but I'm always surprised by new things happening in spectrum policy, and hate that moment when someone introduces you as an expert in spectrum policy, which is immediately followed by them asking me a question which I don't know the answer to. But I'm very pleased to be chairing this session because it does hark back rather to my roots as an academic and as someone who's studied sociology at university. And it's very pleasing to be chairing a session which is about how mobility is shaping our society and stimulating innovation, because it's an opportunity to discuss the positive things that a increasingly mobile society produces, but also some of the more negative things which are a natural concern amongst people that you talk to, amongst your family, your friends, but you also read about them in the media. I just wanted to share with you, to start, one personal experience which happened to me the day before yesterday, which was that I was walking in London and down a shopping street, and I went past a cafe, and I noticed in the cafe there was an old lady there. Forgive me for using a politically incorrect term. A lady must have been in her late 70s, if not early 80s, and she had the classic sort of thing like that, and she had her hand down. I thought, gosh, she's texting, that's surprising. And I looked down, and I could see, yes, she was texting. She was using a smartphone with a big screen, looked rather like an iPhone. And I thought, how unusual. You don't expect people of that age to be doing that. And then I looked across at who was sitting with her at the table, and it was another lady, her friend of the same age. And she was also texting or using her iPhone. And I was struck by how much this showed how society, our social behaviour, had been changed by wireless technologies, because this is the kind of thing that you imagine that only teenagers would do. And you are concerned, if you're a parent, about things like, are your children becoming increasingly isolated from their friends? Do they spend their time texting when they should be actually interacting with the real people who's there with you? Are they more concerned about Facebook than you are of you talking to them? And here are these two old ladies, in at least their 70s, doing exactly what many people are concerned about teenagers doing, sitting instead of talking to each other, texting. So this session is an opportunity to assess how far mobile developments in spectrum are changing our lives, how far the wireless market is changing our lives, which we look forward to a presentation from Frédéric Pujol from iDate, who will give us a good overview of that. And also, of course, the use of wireless technologies has been very transformative in the developing world, and we're very lucky to have with us Abdul Karim Somalia from the African Telecoms Union, who'll be talking as well. But I'd first of all like to introduce Joël Menrath from Discours et Pratique, who's been doing a study for the French Telecoms Association about how people actually use mobile devices. And I think she can give us a very good perspective on one of those questions that often comes up when people discuss this issue, which is, are we becoming increasingly addicted to the use of our mobile devices? So, Joël, over to you.
Merci beaucoup pour cette introduction. Alors en effet, moi je voudrais vous parler ici du point de vue des usagers. Je pense que je suis peut-être une des seules à avoir cette perspective dans la table ronde, puisque avec d'autres sociologues, dont Laurent Salard, on observe de façon très ethnographique les comportements des utilisateurs, de ceux qu'on appelle les individus connectés, pour essayer de comprendre comment on vit face à cette réalité technique aujourd'hui, qui est celle de la connexion permanente, en tout cas de sa possibilité, et puis de l'abondance des services et des contenus qui est aujourd'hui, alors une des richesses, une des tentations et un des risques sans doute que nous offre le spectre et les différents acteurs qui l'occupent. Alors, comme le disait Martine, je pense que une des inquiétudes actuelles, c'est celle de l'addiction face aux nouvelles technologies, face à cette abondance, à ces tentations, face à cette connexion permanente. Comment ne pas céder tout simplement à l'abandon et on s'en inquiète tout particulièrement pour les jeunes utilisateurs. Et il faut souligner que cette question de l'addiction, elle est présente comme une préoccupation sur nos terrains d'enquête, chez les personnes qu'on interroge. Elle est très relayée par les médias. Il y a toute une série de personnages publics aussi qui s'en saisissent. Et puis des ouvrages qui fleurissent autour de la déconnexion. Je me suis déconnectée d'Internet pendant 6 mois. C'est le titre d'à peu près une dizaine d'ouvrages de par le monde aujourd'hui. Donc de personnes qui font cette expérience radicale. Et je voudrais dire que c'est d'abord très important de montrer, enfin de dire de rappeler que l'addiction est une pathologie avec une définition très précise qu'il est important de rappeler, puisque on est addict à une substance ou à un comportement ou à un objet lorsque on éprouve une dépendance, des dommages physiques ou psychiques contre lesquels on ne sait pas lutter, c'est-à-dire qu'on ne sait pas ajuster son comportement pour diminuer cette souffrance psychique ou physique qu'on éprouve. Et c'est alors qu'on est addict. Or, ce que l'on observe en tant qu'ethnologue ou sociologue quand on regarde les usages, c'est qu'en effet, on se dit facilement addict. Je suis addict à mon mobile, je suis addict à Facebook, je suis addict aux séries télé. Mais au moment où on le dit, où on le déclare, c'est précisément qu'on est dans une réflexivité et dans un ajustement, une tentative d'ajustement de ces comportements. Et c'est ce qui me semble le plus important à souligner aujourd'hui dans les comportements, c'est que au fond, le danger ou le risque posé par le numérique aujourd'hui n'est pas celui de l'abandon à ces tentations, mais plutôt l'hyper-réflexivité ou l'autodiscipline qui est aujourd'hui nécessaire pour être en relation avec les outils. Autrement dit, chacun perçoit un risque de dépendance, mais chacun fait ses efforts, ses ajustements permanents face à ces nouveaux services, à ces nouvelles propositions, à cette connexion permanente. Et c'est ce qui me semble, c'est cette espèce de dialectique un peu complexe qui me semble la plus juste dans le rapport à la connexion aujourd'hui. Je ne sais pas si j'ai encore quelques instants pour continuer, mais du coup, je pense que il faut bien comprendre cette logique paradoxale aujourd'hui qui est celle de la connexion, c'est-à-dire que à la fois il y a toute une série de moments de vie qui nous font éprouver nos rapports aux nouvelles technologies sous la forme d'une continuité entre nous et nos outils. C'est-à-dire qu'on a vraiment aujourd'hui un vécu qui est de l'ordre du prolongement de l'intériorité. On a le sentiment que entre ce qui se passe à l'intérieur de soi, son psychisme, et puis un smartphone, au fond, il n'y a plus de frontières. On pense, on a une émotion et ça peut se traduire par une photo, un texto, un appel envoyé. Donc on a ce prolongement de l'intériorité. Puis d'un autre côté, on a ces efforts de déconnexion qui font le quotidien des individus connectés. Et Monsieur Cave parlait de ces soirées qui ne sont plus des soirées et ces week-ends qui n'en sont plus.